welcome back to my channel. Pilih ulang di channel Santos Serang mohon lor ngamai pating dan ngarang Poole. Patung historiku di antigo teves. Guys, amne rohin hala sira atuluran betul. Tonta sira mai. Maka ambil tama dari do sira. Para sira boleh explicar pating história yang saya.
So, hello and welcome to Poole's Cavern. My name is Charlie and I'll be your tour guide today. So Poole's Cavern behind me here is a 2 million year old limestone cave, formed entirely naturally by ice age floodwaters. Now the water came down through the hillside and you can see that little path going up into the darkness just over there. Now we're going to be following that today, and as we go we're going to see the natural features left behind by the river. Okay, if you want to wait around there, that's fine. So, I saw that you guys managed to have a little look in the exhibition before you came down. Now, most of the artefacts that are found in the exhibition come out of either this chamber or up on the hillside of Briglow behind us. Now, this first chamber that we've entered is one of the most historic in the cave. Principally because if you guys just sweep round, you can see all these peculiar looking sticks poking out the ground. This chamber is basically one where you can see everything and nothing at the same time, as it all has been moved out of this chamber. But all of these little sticks show exactly where about 4,000 artefacts were found in the 1980s. Now, as the name suggests, the majority of these artefacts dated back to the Roman times. And that's largely because of the river that flows down a little bit further on in our cave. Now, I would normally say that you'd be able to hear the river. It's pretty much totally dried up today. But it drops about 60 foot down into the ground, flows in a chamber underneath us, and is heated by the thermal water in the Buxton. Now, when the Romans invaded Britain, they stayed in Buxton the whole time in 79 AD, using it as a place for their thermal spas down in town. They used to use this cave as the spiritual home for the goddess Artemisia, the Roman god of water. Now, most of the artefacts we found were basically offerings left for her. So just up on my left up here, you can see this striky little white rock there. Just behind it is a little pool of water. In the base of it, we found a lot of Roman brooches, jewellery and coins, etc. left as an offering to the goddess. Now, after finding these, we thought there'd be a lot more in this chamber. And as we dug deeper and deeper, at a similar point to when the Romans were down in Buxton, up on that just up there, it looks a little bit like a coat hanger. Now, this is one of 3 in this chamber, and it shows where we found one of 3 full-body human skeletons. This one here was of a prehistoric woman, just up behind these rocks, and where we think we found her son. Now, these 2 we presume were trapped in the cave by a cave collapse in the entrance. Their bodies, when found, were whisked away down to museum archives down in London. Someone we know a little bit more about sits just up here. Again, quite difficult to see, but that little metal rod is where we found the skull of a man named John Poole. John Poole, as you might be able to guess, is what this cave is named after. He was a notorious criminal at the time, mainly known for highway robbery.
Sir hetang mati isim tahat ini terling. Wah.
As we've worked our way along a little bit further, okay, you just look straight up in the ceiling. And to your surprise, just along here, in the roof, is the largest natural feature in Poole's Cavern on the whole. This up here is what we like to call the dome. And the dome was created by Derbyshire's River Wye, just up there. Now, as I say, the river's changed its course now and flows down deep below us. But once upon a time, with ice age floodwaters, that river could have filled this cave right up to the brim. So where we stood now would have just been a tube with water funneling out of the entrance. As the river came down, it brought with it a lot of silt, sediment and mud. You can see this stuff built up here, and slowly it filled in this little archway just over there. Until eventually the water was held dormant in this cave, And instead of the current pushing it out the entrance, it got pushed upwards into the ceiling. It's approximately 50,000 years old. So the way that something like this forms is when it rains, the water sits up in the soil and it works its way down through the cracks in the limestone rock. As it comes down, it picks up little bits of calcium, eventually entering the cave and redepositing it in this formation here. Now these things grow at about 1 centimetre every 100 years. So more commonly, they look like these tiny little sparkles on the roof up above us. So these are all tiny little stalactites that are just beginning to grow. They're between maybe 50 to 500 years old, and they'll continue growing for a number more years before falling onto some unsuspecting tourist head, as they are so weak hanging from the roof up there. Glowstone. And it's created by a much more consistent flow of water. So when the cave's a lot wetter, coming down from the ceiling there's a sheet that looks a little bit like a waterfall. As it comes over the top of this, it leaves behind little bits of calcite. This starts to protrude out from the back, and eventually it's called flowstone because it's supposed to resemble somewhat.
Guys, habli ka explica tana. Meron na tayo yung utama na explica.
Okay, so as we've worked our way up a little bit, just looking down in the riverbed just down there. I've just talked about this once great river that created this whole cave around us, just down below us. It's the mighty Derbyshire River Wye. Now, yeah, it's not quite as exciting as it used to be, but the best way to kind of put this into context is, I'm sure you guys have noticed over this past summer, we've had really heavy rainfall, but, you know, maybe for a day, 12 hours or something. And in this cave, we're only 2 or 3 miles away from the source of the river, so the river will match the amount of time the rain is falling. So if it rains really heavily, it'll come up to maybe the bottom of this rock and drop away again within a day. Back to this rather low level here instead. Now, what the river does is it sits up on the moors of Axe Edge, coming out of a little spring. Comes over the moors and goes down into what we call swallow caves.
Guys, hoy me explica tana kono ba motakip ne. Le agora nel loro sabalete.
Over this little railing. It's the largest chamber in Poole's Cavern on a whole, which we quite imaginatively like to call the long view. And this is what we like to call the flitch of bacon. Now, it stood the test of time very well, and it started off looking somewhat like these little stalactites on the ceiling up here. So it started off very thin and very weak. Grew to about 2 or 3 foot long before the water starts flowing down the outside of it. It gets thicker and thicker, and now it hangs tight to the ceiling up above it. As it's been there for nearly 100,000 years, it's got a few rather strange stories to go along with it. Now, as the Victorians were coming down into this cave by their candlelight, they looked up there and decided it looked suspiciously like a pig. Now, if any of you can see that, I commend your imagination, because I really can't. I think it looks a bit more like a kebab instead. But this is pretty amazing, and they also decided it would be worth quite a lot of money. Hence why its little pointy end is missing at the bottom. Now, they knocked this end off, looked it out of the cave, and realised themselves that calcite's the second most common crystal on Earth. It's worth pretty much nothing. So it was lost for just over 200 years before being found as a garden ornament in one of the houses that's up above us. It now sits just down there below, disguised as a stalagmite. Now, we tested both parts of this, and some people have asked me why we don't just stick it back on to make it look the same as it did before. But if you look at the bottom, there's a slight point in the centre, because despite this breakage, our flitch is still growing. So if you guys wanted to come back in 20,000 years' time to see it finished, please feel free. Before we head on, now these pools in front of us are what we call rimstone pools. They're created in all caves across the globe that have calcite or a different mineral created by water. The way that they form is rocks fell from the ceiling just up above us here. They settled in this formation down below us, and ever since there's been a consistent flow of water down at the top. As the water flows over, it leaves behind little bits of calcite. In between each of the rocks, a little pool is formed. So at the top of the chamber, up in the ceiling to your left, they're about the size of your fingernail. They get bigger and bigger and bigger until you get down to this one, which is about the size of a bath instead. But the interesting thing about them is given unlimited time and unlimited space, they will grow to any size. So there's examples of ones in places like Turkey, which have grown up to an Olympic swimming pool length apart instead. So they'd be about the size of this chamber in front of you. So there are plenty that are getting close. Okay, so the reason why this chamber is lit under UV light is to try and show to you guys that calcite glows in the dark. So that's why it is glowing a little bit up in the ceiling up there. And for any of you who aren't wearing white or fluorescent clothes, you might be glowing a little bit as well. There we go. All depends on the pigments in your clothes. I think my mask does a little bit.
Yeah.
But you know, it all depends what's going on. But it's awesome down here. And if you wanted to take some photos, because I will take the lights back to normal in a minute, I'd recommend doing it without the flash. Because with the flash, it kind of ruins the effect. Now, but I'll leave those up to your imagination. And these ones are under a lot of scientific interest in the cave, largely due to their little orange tips. So originally we thought it was this chemical of iron oxide, which stains this like little overhang here, or this little orange bit to the left as well. But if it was to be iron oxide, the whole thing would be orange, as opposed to just the tip. So we had a few different ideas that it might be something like bacteria's poo, or something. And if you just sweep round, you can see thousands of stalagmites and stalactites, whereas in previous chambers there were just one or two much, much larger ones instead. And it's also affected the stalactites on the ceiling. They look even thinner than the ones we've seen so far. They look even a little bit more menacing. Now, do you remember that little chamber I said went up into the ceiling back of the bridge? And the water gets pushed up into the ceiling, created the chambers up above us, and one comes out just around this corner, just up here. So when the cave was filled with water, you would have drips coming down on the side, in more of a waterfall fashion. Slowly, it created thousands of miniature pillars, like these organ pipes you can see in front of us here, until it eventually looks like the flowstone we have now. And you can really understand why they think it's called flowstone, as it does look somewhat like the water that's just been turned to stone mid-flow. But if you'd like to follow me just around the corner, may I just warn you, the chamber we're about to get into is the smallest one in the cave, so just try and keep this as best you can. All day, just up here. So the corner that we just turned, we've entered what I like to call the Mary Queen of Scots chamber. And it's named after this big pillar just up here. Now if you remember what I said a pillar was before, it's something that touches both the floor and the ceiling. And it wants you to fill this whole wall in front of us. Being the final chamber in Poole's Cavern. Now the Victorians really wanted to know what was on the other side, hence why half of it is missing from what we just walked underneath. It's opened one final chamber for us to head into in a moment. But for anybody visiting this cave previous to the Victorian times, they used to carve their names into the wall. So if you look just at this wall just down here, you can see the carvings all over it. Now admittedly, most of the initials, I couldn't promise you they're any older than about 20 years. But for some of them, or one in particular, it's quite important to us. So there's a photo of it in the exhibition, if you don't believe me, but it sits right down at the bottom, just down here. Now you might be able to see if you look closely, the R-O and the L-O-C-K of the name Roland Lockie, from London in 1609. Now 1609 was just over 400 years ago. Back then, anybody visiting this cave would have been following the course of the river, just down there. I'm sure you're glad to not be stood in the river now. So it's quite lucky that Roland Lockie stretched up to write his name so high, because it's nearly completely disappeared with the implementation of the path, so we don't know what could be below that. Now, we trace back who Roland Lockie was, and he was a portrait artist at the time. Most famous for his portrait of Mary Queen of Scots. Obviously not this big lump of wet rock, but the woman herself. And you might know a little bit about her. She held a coup against the Queen, was held under house arrest across Britain, and ended up staying in Buxton for a couple of months, in the Old Hall Hotel. Now the story goes that she came down into this cave, looked up at that pillar, demanded it be named after herself. She proceeded to hug it and kiss it, and said anybody to do the same would be grand. Now you might be able to see these little black and white spots on the roof just up here. They look a little bit like the soot that we've seen before. In actual fact, they're little bits of dried bat poo. So here we stand underneath the bat's toilet. In the cave there's about 40 to 70 different mating pairs of bat. And if you did want to see one, there's one sleeping in the entranceway. I can show you on the way out if you'd like. Now, normally there's about 5 species that live up in the woods and then they sleep down in the cave. We very rarely see. So you've spotted it already, but this is what we're going to be looking at in this chamber. And this is one of the largest pieces of calcite in Poole's Cavern. It does look pretty cool, and you guys are really lucky today, because when this big lump of crystal is wet, it looks like one massive soggy cauliflower, and it doesn't sparkle at all. Now today, it looks awesome. And the reason why it sparkles, unlike the rest of the stuff that we've seen, is because when I shine my torch in, it reflects off the rock behind it and comes straight back out. Whereas the other bits of calcite have been one big lump instead. The way that it's all formed is due to what's up behind it. Here, up here. So this is what we call the boulder choke, the largest cave collapse this cave has ever seen. The rocks fell down from the ceiling, settled in this formation here, and ever since, it's been a consistent drip. And these little curtain ends just up here. Now as the drips come off that, they go onto this back rock here, pool in the centre, and flow down through the middle of the rock. And if you look at the middle there, you might be able to see there's little ripples in the rock. Now these are all tiny little rimstone pools that have just begun to grow. So this is what it looks like at the top of that chamber back at the bridge. And given more time,
Oke guys, hau meta filana, saya meta.
Hai.
Oin lorong lawas lo mai tong fating nene, tama danger stoang, tang fatu kuak na kuku depois dalang masalah dun so embo buat duni. Hope you guys like the video. Saya gosta karek like subscribe, bana bema sudah subscribe para imbel hari pala punya video. Tir mai amba fatin selu karek bele imbel hari I fatine naram Poole's Cavern. Okay guys, então manena, thanks for watching e don't forget like, subscribe, share. Obrigado barak by imine nonton. Ciao.